It was just another typical afternoon in the quiet suburb of Willow Creek, where kids played on sidewalks, sprinklers watered the neat lawns, and the sun cast a gentle, golden light over the neighborhood. The type of day that felt slow, peaceful, and predictable. And for Marcus and Malik, twin brothers just 15 years old, it was a routine afternoon stroll, something they did every day after school to unwind and catch up. Today they were walking along the tree-lined streets, tossing around talk about homework, basketball, and the latest video game they were eager to play. But as they ambled along, they had no idea that this ordinary walk was about to take a turn that would stay with them forever. A few blocks down, hidden just around a corner, the low rumble of a police cruiser's engine idled quietly. Inside sat Officer Steele, a man well known around the neighborhood, but not for the reasons one might hope. He was known for his sharp gaze and sharper assumptions, always on high alert for anything he thought looked out of place. And when he spotted Marcus and Malik, two young black teens walking alone, his suspicion flared, and his foot pressed down on the gas pedal. Suddenly, the calm of Willow Creek was shattered by the loud screech of tires. The police car skidded to a halt just a few feet in front of the twins, blocking their path with a suddenness that made them both freeze. They exchanged a look, a mix of confusion and alarm flashing in their eyes. Marcus instinctively reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over the screen, ready to record if he needed to. Malik shifted slightly, trying to stand a bit taller, his face a mask of calm, though his heart pounded. Officer Steele stepped out of the cruiser, his gaze narrowed, suspicion etched into every line of his expression. His voice was as cold as steel itself when he barked, "Hands where I can see them." His tone left no room for questions or objections, and Marcus and Malik, though unsure why they'd become the targets of such intense scrutiny, slowly raised their hands. They knew the drill. They'd had the talk from their parents more times than they could count, a necessary lesson for survival in situations like this. But that knowledge didn't dull the sting of feeling so immediately judged, so unfairly singled out. The boys stood silently, their hands raised, as Officer Steele approached them. His face held a hard, unyielding look, and his hand hovered over his belt, ready to draw if he thought he needed to. To him, these were just two kids who, in his eyes, must be up to no good. The quiet suburb was no place for teenagers walking alone, he seemed to think, as if their very presence was a threat to the peace he was sworn to protect. But if he'd only known who they really were, if he'd taken a moment to look past the color of their skin, past his assumptions, perhaps he would have thought twice. Marcus and Malik exchanged a quick, knowing look, a blend of confusion, irritation, and resignation in their eyes. It was a silent conversation that passed between them, one that didn't need words. They hadn't done anything wrong. They were just two kids taking a walk after school, like so many other kids in this neighborhood. But as they stood there with Officer Steele glaring down at them, that didn't seem to matter at all. The officer's face was hard, his eyes cold and dismissive. He looked at them, not with curiosity or even caution, but with something closer to contempt. As if they didn't belong here, as if their very presence in the neighborhood was an offense. "Answer me," he barked, his tone harsh and cutting. "What are you boys doing here?" He spat out the words, and the implication was clear. In his mind, they had no business being in this quiet suburb, not without some kind of ulterior motive. Malik clenched his jaw, feeling the unfairness of it all. They hadn't done anything to attract this level of suspicion. But experience had taught them to be cautious, to tread carefully. Their parents had drilled it into them from a young age. Stay calm, don't provoke, don't escalate. And so, despite the injustice of it, they did what they'd been taught to do. "We're just walking home, sir," Marcus replied, keeping his tone steady and respectful. But the words didn't seem to make any difference to Officer Steele. He didn't seem to care that they were just heading home. In his mind, they were already guilty of something. He just hadn't decided what that was yet. "Oh, really?" Steele sneered, a mocking smirk curling at the corners of his mouth. Just taking a stroll, huh? His tone was dripping with disbelief, as if the very idea of two young black boys walking through the neighborhood was so outlandish it had to be a cover for something more sinister. He looked them up and down, sizing them up with a gaze that felt like a searchlight, piercing and invasive. Malik could feel his pulse quickening, a hot flush of anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to breathe, to stay calm. This was not the first time they'd faced judgment, suspicion, or even outright hostility, but it never got any easier. The twins had grown up learning to navigate these moments, each encounter adding to a well of quiet resilience. They'd endured the sidelong glances, the wary stares, the whispered assumptions that seemed to follow them wherever they went. There were the subtle questions that weren't really questions at all, just thinly veiled accusations. Are you sure you can afford to shop here? Or do you live in this neighborhood? And while they hated it, they had learned to live with it. But there was something different about Officer Steele. His disdain was less subtle, his mistrust plain as day, as if he didn't care to hide the assumptions he was making about them. As Steele continued to glare at them, Malik's mind flashed back to conversations with their father, who had always warned them about situations like this. Their father, a man who had spent his life standing up for justice, had instilled in them the importance of staying calm and composed, even when they felt the burn of unfair treatment. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, he'd tell them. But don't give them an excuse to turn their suspicions into something more. And so, despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface, Malik took a deep breath, swallowing back the urge to say something that might make things worse. But Steele's scrutiny didn't let up. He stepped closer, looming over them, making a show of his authority. You know, I think I've seen you two around here before, he said, his tone dripping with accusation. Always up to something, aren't you? It wasn't a question, not really. It was a judgment, a decision he'd already made in his mind. Malik clenched his fists at his sides, keeping his gaze steady, meeting Steele's eyes but saying nothing. He could feel Marcus beside him, standing as still as a statue, trying not to react. They knew that any hint of defiance, any sign of frustration, would only fuel Steele's assumptions, only give him an excuse to go further. For a moment, the street was silent except for the faint hum of the police radio crackling in the cruiser. Steele's fingers drummed against his belt, hovering dangerously close to his handcuffs, as if daring them to step out of line. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating, pressing down on them with an unspoken threat. The neighborhood around them seemed to have fallen silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus forced himself to speak again, his voice level, though there was a tightness in it that betrayed his frustration. Officer, we're just on our way home. We live a few blocks down. That's all. He kept his tone steady, respectful, giving Steele no reason to escalate. But Steele just chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. He shook his head, as if he didn't believe a word Marcus was saying. You live here, he sneered, disbelief etched into every line of his face. Well, isn't that something, he muttered, more to himself than to them. A couple of kids like you, in this neighborhood. The implication was loud and clear, even if he didn't say the words outright. To him, they didn't belong here. And that was all the reason he needed to stop them, to question them, to let them know, in no uncertain terms, that they were under suspicion simply for existing in a place he decided wasn't meant for them. And in that moment, the twins felt the full weight of Steele's disdain. It was a feeling that was all too familiar, but one that never became any easier to bear. They felt small, trapped, their voices stifled by the assumptions being piled onto them. They knew they hadn't done anything wrong, but in Steele's eyes, their innocence was irrelevant. In his eyes, they were guilty until proven otherwise. As Officer Steele lifted his radio to call for backup, Malik's gaze flicked to a small, glinting nameplate on the officer's chest. Steele. Recognition sparked immediately. He'd heard that name before, many times, in fact. Malik's father, A well-known lawyer in the community had talked about this man, warning about an Officer Steele who had a notorious reputation for bending the law. Steele was infamous for making arrests on shaky grounds, often targeting people who couldn't easily defend themselves. He was the kind of cop Malik's father had spent years trying to expose, but every attempt seemed to end with Steele slipping out of reach, somehow shielded by the system he was supposed to serve. The realization settled heavily on Malik, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he glanced at his brother, giving a quick, meaningful nod. Marcus understood immediately, his hand subtly slipping into his pocket to hit the record button on his phone. The screen lit up, capturing Steele's words, his stance, every insult laced in his tone. This was no ordinary stop, no random encounter, and they both felt it. This was an opportunity, one that Marcus and Malik weren't about to let slip away. Steele continued, oblivious to the recording happening right under his nose. "I've got 2 suspects here. Might need some backup," he muttered into his radio, the disdain in his voice clear. His words dripped with assumption, as if he'd already decided they were guilty of something. Anything. The twins remained silent, aware of every second passing, as Steele dug himself in deeper. Malik thought back to all the times he'd heard his father talk about the importance of gathering evidence, about documenting everything in situations like these. His father had always warned him to be prepared, to know his rights, to understand how easily a situation could be twisted. And now, with Steele standing there, exuding arrogance and prejudice, Malik felt a strange sense of calm. They were collecting the proof they needed, one recorded word at a time. Steele shot them a smug look, clearly assuming he had all the power. Little did he know, the tables were about to turn. "All right, enough of this," Steele muttered, stepping forward with handcuffs in hand, eyes locked on Marcus as if daring him to resist. He reached out, intent on making an arrest without any justification. Just as he was about to clamp the cuffs onto Marcus's wrist, a deep, commanding voice rang out from behind him, freezing him in his tracks. "Unhand my sons." The words cut through the air like a knife, and Officer Steele's face turned a sickly shade of pale as he turned around. Standing there was Mr. Thompson, the city's renowned civil rights lawyer, and Marcus and Malik's father. His expression was cold, his eyes hard as they bore into Steele with an intensity that left no room for doubt. Every ounce of Steele's assumed power evaporated in that instant, replaced by a creeping sense of dread. "Officer Steele, do you have any idea who you're harassing?" Mr. Thompson's voice was sharp, steady, and unmistakably authoritative, making it clear he was not a man to be trifled with. Steele's mouth opened, but no words came out. He glanced from Mr. Thompson to the twins, realization dawning that this was not the easy target he'd assumed. Mr. Thompson wasted no time, reaching into his coat and pulling out a document, a formal order to investigate Steele's conduct. He held it up, the official seal unmistakable, and Steele's face blanched as he recognized the significance of it. The officer's confidence crumbled, and then, as if things couldn't get worse for Steele, Mr. Thompson stepped aside to reveal a small news crew, cameras already rolling, capturing every second of this tense encounter. It was clear this was no accident. This was a meticulously planned moment, a trap Steele had walked right into. The twins stood tall beside their father, the weight of their evidence and the support of the media all poised against the officer who had tried to intimidate them. Steele's arrogance had been his undoing, and now, with his every action documented, he had no escape. As the cameras rolled, Officer Steele's once steady composure unraveled. Reporters closed in, their microphones aimed like arrows, each question cutting through his faltering defenses. The arrogance he had displayed just moments before was gone, replaced by the unmistakable look of a man cornered with no easy way out. He tried to answer, to stammer out justifications, but each excuse crumbled under the weight of mounting evidence and Mr. Thompson's unyielding gaze. "Officer Steele, can you explain why you detained these young men without cause?" Are you aware of the allegations of racial profiling tied to your record? Steele's attempts to deflect only worsened his situation, each response sounding weaker, each excuse sounding hollower. Meanwhile, Marcus and Malik stood by their father's side, watching as Steele's power and authority dissolved. They had come into this situation as ordinary teenagers, facing down a man who saw them as easy targets. But now, they were standing as victors, their quiet resilience and smart planning having turned Steele's weaponized authority against him. After several more minutes of uncomfortable questioning, Steele was finally ordered to turn in his badge and gun on the spot, pending a formal investigation. His eyes darted around as if searching for an escape, but there was none. Mr. Thompson's expression was resolute, his gaze never leaving Steele, ensuring there was no way out. The officer's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he looked small, his intimidation stripped away and replaced by the reality of his own accountability. The irony was undeniable. Steele, who had sought to wield his authority unchecked, was now subject to the very system he had abused for so long. And then, in an almost poetic twist, Steele was led to his own police cruiser, his hands empty where his cuffs had once been. As he was placed in the back seat, the same seat he had planned to put Marcus and Malik in, the crowd that had gathered around watched in silence, a mix of disbelief and satisfaction reflected in their faces. The whispers grew louder, and soon, word spread quickly among the bystanders, and throughout the community, justice was finally being served. For Marcus and Malik, this moment was more than just personal vindication. It was a turning point. They knew that they had not only stood up for themselves, but for countless others who had experienced similar encounters without the resources or support to fight back. As they walked away, heads held high, their father placed a hand on each of their shoulders, pride clear in his eyes. They had done more than survive this encounter. They had won. The ripple effect was immediate. By the end of the day, news stations across the city were running the footage, covering the story of the two young men who had taken a stand against discrimination and exposed corruption within the system. Steele's face flashed across screens, a symbol of abuse of power that had finally been confronted. He faced suspension, possible charges, and a very public reckoning. But for the community, this was a victory larger than any single consequence he would face. Marcus and Malik became local heroes, not just for what they endured, but for how they turned the situation into a powerful lesson about courage and justice. Neighbors approached them in the days that followed, congratulating them, thanking them, and sharing their own stories of times they had felt unseen or misjudged. The community felt inspired, energized by the knowledge that change was possible, even in the face of intimidation and prejudice. Through it all, Marcus and Malik stayed grounded, grateful for the support and proud of the stand they had taken. And their father, who had spent years advocating for justice, looked at his sons with a newfound admiration. They were no longer just the boys he tried to protect. They were young men who had stepped up to protect themselves and others. In the weeks that followed, policies were reviewed, accountability measures strengthened, and Steele's case became a cautionary tale for the force. And as the community continued to rally, Marcus and Malik became symbols of resilience, proof that even the smallest voices, when united and unyielding, could shake the foundations of injustice. Justice had not only been served but had sparked a change that would echo far beyond that quiet afternoon in Willow Creek. The drive home was quiet at first, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The weight of the day's events settled slowly, the magnitude of what had happened taking root in the silence. Marcus gazed out the window, watching the familiar streets roll by, but he saw them differently now. It was as if the world had shifted just slightly, revealing something hidden. Malik, seated next to him, was still, his mind replaying each moment, each decision that had led to Steele's exposure. They knew they had made a difference, not just for themselves but for everyone watching, everyone who had ever felt voiceless and unheard. Mr. Thompson, his hand steady on the wheel, glanced back at his sons in the rearview mirror, Pride shone in his eyes, a quiet but unmistakable pride for the strength they had shown, for the calm and courage they had embodied in the face of injustice. He had taught them to stand tall, to know their worth, but today they had shown him just how powerfully they had taken those lessons to heart. After a few more minutes of silence, he finally spoke, his voice gentle but filled with conviction. "Boys," he began, pausing as if searching for the right words to convey what he felt, "never let anyone make you feel small. Today, you showed the world that respect and dignity aren't just given, they're claimed. You didn't let him take that from you." Marcus and Malik looked at each other, a shared understanding passing between them. They had felt the weight of Steele's judgment, the sting of his assumptions, but they had held firm. They'd remembered everything their father had taught them, every lesson about patience, about standing up without backing down. And today, they had proven that strength wasn't about size or force, it was about resilience. Mr. Thompson continued, his voice steady, but filled with an intensity that held them captive. "Sometimes, the quietest voices hold the most power. People like Steele, they see silence as weakness. They see it as an opportunity, a reason to feel big. But you showed him today that silence isn't submission. You turned his own arrogance against him." He paused, letting his words sink in, and then he added, "And those who judge by appearances, they're the ones who never see it coming. Steele looked at you and thought he knew everything about you, that you were just two boys who'd stay silent, who wouldn't fight back. But you've shown him, and everyone watching, that character is deeper than anything someone can see on the surface." The twins felt a renewed sense of pride, a deep satisfaction that went beyond the momentary victory over Steele. This was about more than just their story. It was about a truth they had always known but had now seen play out in real life. They had felt the power of standing together, of using their strength to make something right. In a world that sometimes judged them unfairly, today they had been able to rise above, to claim a voice that would be remembered. The car rolled to a stop in their driveway, and Mr. Thompson turned around to face them fully. "What you did today matters," he said, his eyes reflecting years of his own battles, his own victories and losses in the fight for justice. "You'll have more challenges, but remember that this is what strength looks like. It's knowing who you are, no matter what anyone else tries to tell you." Marcus and Malik nodded, a sense of purpose settling in their chests. They had faced something hard and come out stronger, and in doing so, they had shown not just Steele but their whole community that courage and resilience would always have the final say. As they stepped out of the car, Malik looked at Marcus and gave a small, knowing smile. They didn't need to say much. They both understood. This day would stay with them, not just as a memory, but as a reminder of who they were and who they could be. They had seen firsthand that sometimes the quietest voices, when spoken at the right moment, could echo the loudest. And as they walked toward the front door with their father by their side, they knew this was just the beginning. They had set a precedent, one that wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. For themselves, and for those who would come after, they had made a statement, a promise. No matter the challenges, they would always stand tall, together, with voices that could not be silenced.